Hello, Andrea Morsek-Grazzini, founder and CEO of WetheP. Welcome. Today we're going to have a very important discussion around civic engagement with an unlikely and perhaps unexpected change agent, Jim Keenan. Jim Keenan grew up in Apple Valley, Minnesota. And full disclosure, I know Jim from growing up in Burnsville, Minnesota, an adjacent community. He's going to share with us how he came into civic engagement in the most unlikely and most difficult of possible ways. Thanks for coming, Jim.
Thanks for having me.
So, give me a little bit of background on how you came into civic engagement. I know that, and maybe you didn't even consider it civic engagement, but we do. It clearly is. So what happened?
I didn't consider it civic engagement. Sure I have since. I came into trying to get my message out through a lawsuit that I started with the Catholic Church after having been a victim of sexual abuse at the hands of a priest.
Okay, tell me where, I know of course where, but share with us where and approximately when this all happened.
It was at Church of the Risen Savior. It was in the early 80s, 1980, 81-ish.
And this is Burnsville, Minnesota?
This is in Burnsville, Minnesota. My family was members of the parish. In fact, my family was, I think, one of the first families to start the parish. My brother and I were two of the very first altar boys when the church used to use the elementary school cafeteria as their sanctuary. And my older brother and I also were the altar boys for the very first Mass of consecration at the church. So it was the church was a big deal at our house. My dad was always an usher. That's where your mom and my mom became very close friends, and it was our complete, and I would say outside of our neighbors on either side of us, it was our total social situation. So.
And your family with all those boys was well known. I remember where you sat in the church. I remember your parents, and your parents are still active in that same church, right?
Very much so.
Great.
Very much so. My mom was the first female to give a sermon at the pulpit. Which was a big deal for her, you know, and a special moment in her life. I didn't attend for obvious reasons.
This was when you were an adult?
Yes.
Okay.
It was just a couple years ago. Years ago. So through my journey of this long lawsuit that went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court, and we ended up losing on a split vote based on statute of limitations. I think when that happened, I became more engaged.
Let's dig into that, and I want to hear more about how you became engaged, but I want to just do a little chronology. So when did you decide to go to do the lawsuit?
Right around 2003.
Okay.
I first met with Jeff Anderson, and my case was somewhat unique in that I really didn't have vivid memories of the abuse until an adult age. And my wife and I were outside one summer afternoon, and I should preface it, I met my wife in grade 9, and so she knew me very well, and I met her just after the abuse stopped.
Okay.
And so she knew me as kind of that adolescent boy who was, you know, goofy and you know, tried machismo and tried all the sports and, you know, and just searching for himself. So she knew a lot about me. And she would describe blue funks that I would get into, especially around summertime. And that's the time of year the abuse took place. And one day it just started coming out, and she called my mom and dad, and my mom said to me, are you having memories or flashbacks, because she knew I had spent a lot of time with Father Tom.
And by this time, he'd already been in the news several years prior.
Yes.
We already knew that he was had abused numerous children in that parish and others.
Yes, I was told that I'm somewhere in the neighborhood of the 33rd, 34th victim.
Out of
however many there may be to come forward.
So, did your parents have any inkling that this was happening when you were children?
In talking to my mom afterwards, you know, in armchair quarterbacking, anything is you know, you can really put the dots together. But she kind of, as a mom, I think had a sense something wasn't right with things. And the day that I told her, and then the days after that, when we had numerous talks, and the dots were put together, she kind of went, I see how the whole grooming process took place, and and how he's an incredibly likable person.
I remember him.
And when you come from the family I came from, talk about kind of a feather in the cap and a little bit of a, hey,
good Catholic
look
boy,
at that.
right?
My kid gets to go golfing with the priest, and my kid gets to go to the racket club with the priest, and he's not out doing negativity. He's hanging with the priest, and in fact, in our house, one of the mainstay rules, if you were going out with friends, were if you couldn't do it with the priest, that's not an activity you should be doing.
Oh dear, oh
I know,
dear.
isn't that
so
ironic?
he was endorsed around as he would be, as a priest would be for many of us Catholic children.
Oh yeah, it was quite a mark of honor, I think, for my mom and dad.
So how hard was it for you to process this with your mom years later?
Oh geez, I don't know that we're done, to be honest.
Well, we'll talk about that more later, because that's a
definitely.
pretty emotional topic, and I think it's really critical because when we're dealing with civic engagement, we're often dealing with highly personal issues, and and how do we address those? And I think you've got really valuable things to add to that, and maybe even how complex and how hard and how long it takes to address it.
Definitely.
But for now, let's go back then. Let's go back. So you came many years later. This started occurring to you that something was going on. What was your first, other than telling your wife and calling your mother, then what? I mean, how long did it take you to decide that you wanted to go to do so much as the lawsuit?
It was probably close to 2 years from the time that I had the idea solidified that yes, these events happened, to when I went to a lawyer. And really the reason I went to a lawyer was the Catholic Church all but shut me out.
Okay, so tell me about what you'd tried before you went to a lawyer.
My wife and I at the time were very involved at St. Michael's Parish in Prior Lake, and involved in that we were faithful attendees. We taught religion classes. It was still very much our path, if you will. And so the first thing I did was call Father Rick, and multiple days later, countless phone calls on my end. I remember leaving distraught phone calls where he probably didn't understand what I was saying.
Because you were so shook up.
I was sobbing. And then meeting with him and basically getting a no response.
So first of all, he didn't respond real immediately.
No.
And what do you make of that?
I think he had, personally, my sense is that he probably already had a list or a procedure that he had to call somebody higher than him and get guidance.
Makes sense, makes sense. And then when you met with him, that had to be pretty frustrating because he wasn't able to or willing to give you any feedback whatsoever.
There was
no advice, no.
I'm sorry, oh my gosh, this is horrible, let's get the ball rolling on fixing these things. There was none of that. It was very cold and kind of, okay. I remember leaving just feeling like, now who do I go to?
Did that set you back at all?
I think at that point I was still kind of reeling. This was probably 2-3 days after the first memory.
Okay.
I remember saying to Father Rick, I hope my goal is to work all through this and then be a parishioner who can kind of talk to the people and say, yep, these things happened and here's why some good has come out of it.
So you were already, although you didn't call it that, your primary motivation at that time was to take this really difficult situation that you'd endured, that you'd suffered, and turn it into a way to help others heal and grow, right? Very soon.
Yep.
Okay.
I think so.
So Father Rick gave you little to go on, and then where to from there?
Then I called the priest who married Steph and I, Father Griffin.
This is
Father Pat, and he was down at St. Stephen's down in the city, and I got an appointment to see him and went into his office, and he's the guy who baptized my boy. He married my wife and I. He was very close with my parents.
Very nice man.
Very nice man. And outside of a phone number for a administrative assistant at the district or the diocese, that was about it. I remember he put his hand on my shoulder and kind of gave me some condolences, but there was nothing that you would think you would get from somebody who was in that role.
A counselor and
yeah,
right, and a healer,
no
sort of.
sense of empathy or, you know, I'm so sorry. The thing that was in my head was I wasn't getting told that anyone was sorry. And that started to kind of be something. It was like I started to see that this entity wasn't about acceptance or anything. And I can honestly say since that day, I've not heard from Father Pat one time.
Oh, dear. And that's
or
heartbreaking.
Anyone from very heartbreaking. Very heartbreaking. And I've seen him close up in public, as close as you and I are without a word.
I know Father Pat well. He is a very nice man. And this is what complicates us all. There are very nice priests and leaders of the church that are, whether they like it or not, are wrapped up in all of this.
Right. And I just had to believe in my heart that somehow he was given marching orders. You know, it didn't, what I knew of him, and really Father Rick too at the time, their action towards me after knowing didn't necessarily parallel what I had known of them before.
So suddenly they sort of changed. This
Right.
wasn't what you knew them as, you know, their natural operating.
No, there was a new interaction style with
Right.
Jim Keenan.
Right, specifically, not necessarily with others.
Not well, I couldn't speak to that, but like to how I was treated
Sure.
and kind of my wife on the side, I would say it was a little different. And then at that point you start to realize, okay, I'm not going to get support from the entity that allowed the abuse to happen in the first place.
Did you try to go to the Archdiocese at all?
I went there and to meet with a lady, and she basically gave me the name of 3 or 4 therapists that I could contact. And
Here in Minnesota or elsewhere?
Here in Minnesota. And based on, I'm assuming, past lawsuits, there was some provisions that they needed to pay for ongoing therapy of any victims.
So they offered to pay for therapy?
Yep, and I went.
Okay. And so did you find that useful, and did they cover all the costs of therapy, and how long did you go?
I did find it incredibly useful, and I'm a psychologist by trade,
That's
so
right.
it was a little interesting the first couple sessions because I argued about diagnosis and things like that. You know, and it was
little
just
professional.
it was almost that I want to be here, I really want to be here, but I don't want to engage in what I know I'm going to have to engage in.
Right.
And so I diverted. But it was incredibly helpful. They paid for a lot of it. They stopped paying for it at one point, and my attorney explained to them why they had to continue. I went pretty solid for about 9-10 months, and that's 3-4 times a week. And then I went kind of weaned off, was out of it for a while, went back, all told over the course of about 3 years.
And so what was the net effect of the therapy? You're a therapist, you believe in it. In fact, Jim has a firm where he is the principal and the lead of 50-some therapists. So this is very much your passion and your profession. So tell me, how did you just
what it did for me is it when trauma happens, I think what the psyche kind of holds it out here because it's afraid, and the self is in that fight or flight against it all the time. And what I was able to do was integrate it and make it a part of me. When all of these memories were very fresh, if I saw a priest or people started talking about it, I could easily find myself in tears, and it would just kind of be this rush of emotion, almost kind of like, here we are, you got to deal.
So you you had the wherewithal to let yourself have these feelings rather than deny them, which is our common practice.
Exactly.
And you had a lot of catching up to do in a sense, because in fact you had been denying them, whether you knew it or not. I mean, as we do,
and
we
I had
repress.
to rewrite some rules that I was living by internally. I had to address some immaturities, I think, that had occurred at the time of abuse that I just kind of deemed as uniquenesses to me.
Right. Can you explain those?
I think in terms of relationship being very I didn't go a lot of places alone. With my kids, I never let them go to any place alone, bathrooms. I was very overprotective. I always found myself looking, where are the exit? who doesn't seem right.
So there was something in your subconscious that just had an impulse to be protective.
Yeah, and it was just kind of, on one level, it was kind of a joke with people because they knew if I came to the restaurant, I may be asking
You were the freaky dad that was kind of driving your children crazy.
Absolutely.
I mean, I am the freaky mom,
Right,
but
right. But yeah. So I had a lot of little quirks, and we used a technique in therapy called EMDR.
Sure.
And what I think that did.
And explain EMDR if you would. Just quickly.
EMDR it somehow bridges what I would call gaps between the conscious and the subconscious.
It's a bit of biofeedback in a way?
It's a little bit. It's usually an eye movement over the eyes, and it allows the body to just kind of go and experience the feelings. It's very powerful. But what it did after a number of sessions was allow me to face the abuse and not have it wreck me, and not have it be like I'm driving down the road and I'm crying for no reason. It really started to integrate me with me, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
And so then what happened was I was able to start to address all of the other ripple effects that this caused.
Okay.
You know, all of the relationship issues with my bride, parenting issues that I have had with my two sons, things at work. You know, addressing that. You know, looking back over clients that I had and really being able to evaluate. Were you able to go where you needed to go with the client?
So you clicked right into, in a way, you clicked right into your natural healer mode, and you were healing yourself, but also seeing how your experience could improve not only your personal relationships, but also your clients' relationship or your clients' outcomes. In fact, I want to go back, and we'll talk more about that because it's really fascinating, and it really gets to a concept known as citizen professionalism, where you are taking your own expertise, and yours is of course, very unique because it was very complicated. I think, if I'm understanding you correctly, you did sort of fall apart, and yet you pulled yourself together with the help of therapy and with working through it, and then taking both your personal experience and your professional experience and sort of synthesizing those into civic engagement. Again, you didn't call it this, but that's exactly what you were doing. Yeah.
You know, when I was falling apart, I stopped seeing clients. You know, if I'm not a whole self, I can't be the healer I want to be. But now it's amazing because, you know, when I started doing some things after we lost our case to help get a law changed, you know, and you start to get out there and you tell this story not in a way that says, hey, look at these bad people, but in a way that says these things happen and there needs to be a level of accountability and opportunity for everybody to engage in our legal system.
Well, it's interesting that you're taking that angle, and I think it's a really thoughtful angle, because it's not what we know of people who have been abused, and there's so many of us that have been. I mean, the statistics are horrible. That can really make a person bitter. It can, particularly the Catholic Church has really struggled with this. There has, because of the way that they've hidden some of the issues, or what appears to be over many, many years, and the way that they have protected themselves and not always supported victims like you. So the bitterness and even maybe a sense of revenge may be somewhat understandable for some. But that really, I mean, I'm sure, okay, so explain that.
I definitely had it. There was a point where I wanted to tell my story to every Catholic with the goal of getting them to quit the Catholic Church. And I would preface, you know, especially after my first press conference, because I was John Doe 76C.
And this was what year?
A couple years back, 2009
or 10?
Yeah, somewhere in there. And I came out as James Keenan. All of a sudden, friends were, because I hadn't told anybody. You know, it's not something you just go, hey, by the way. And so I had some friends that were upset that I hadn't told them, that I hadn't reached out for support. I had other friends that were upset that I was no longer Catholic, and this explains why we don't see you Sundays, and these types of things. And I was just bitter. I mean, bitter party of one. Here we are, and the anger really. There were times where it was just all I could think about. You know, I would think about, you know, what can I do? How can I voice this? How can I? In
a sense, you weren't getting resolution. You were getting internal resolution somewhat, but if you were bitter, maybe not so much.
It was just all about the wrong things, and just it was wrecking me too. And I was asked the question once, you know, hey, you know, this man kind of wrecked you back when you were a child. Why are you letting it wreck you still? And I started to kind of make that transformation between, okay, now I'm angry at everybody, to acceptance, this occurred.
Right.
It's part of who I am. I can't, there's no way I can change that. But what I can do is I can start to figure out, how can I use this? How can I be a voice? Because I'm a very, I think, normal guy. And when people have heard my story, I'm very open with it now. If you want to sit down and ask me about it, ask away. But I do so in a way that I want to educate people.
Right.
My mom and dad never had a fear that when I would leave for Apple Valley Golf Course with Father Tom, that there would be touching going on. It wasn't even a consideration. But had they known, they would have made a more educated decision. Maybe they would have asked the church a little more. Maybe they would have said, hey, as parishioners, we want a full background check and disclosure to everybody in the parish. Those types of things.
So some of this was informal, am I getting it? And then there was the lawsuit. Okay.
Yeah, and then the lawsuit.
So there was sort of the more informal, whoever I speak to, whoever will hear me out, I presume. So then you got
and
to...
that came more towards the end of the lawsuit. The first couple of years of the lawsuit, I didn't even tell people I was suing the church.
And why is that? Did you feel that you'd get resolution and you didn't so much need to?
No, because I think part of the reason is when people hear the word I'm suing, they automatically attach a dollar figure. Oh, what are you going for? And
what were you going for?
I was going for, certainly there was going to be some sort of dollar figure. Because to me, that's more between the lawyers, because they all got to cover their time. I was going for, what kind of policies can we change? How can we make it happen that a priest who first abused in 1961, 6 years before his 30-some-odd victim was born, how can we make it so that he's never in front of children again? How can we make that happen? How can we make it, ultimately what I would like to see is if you or I, or as a parent, find out that our child was abused, our first call is to the local authorities, and that priest is gone and arrested. Just like you or I would.
And why can't we do that?
I don't know. I don't know why that.
What would happen if I tried to do something? If I was a parent whose child was abused, what would? So I call the police. Then what happens?
I don't know.
Okay, and that's what you were trying to address.
Yeah.
So in your lawsuit, you specifically said, I think the ask that I saw was $50,000. Is that correct?
I think that was their first offer.
The financial.
Okay,
that was their first offer.
That was an offer
okay,
of one of theirs to me.
Okay.
And when we did mediation for settling the case, all I wanted at that point was release the names of the priests that you have.
And I really want to get to that, because that's a huge, and it's certainly very timely right now, because it suddenly popped all over the news that this is the main crux of the problem. Bad metaphor, but it is, right? I mean, it's protecting children by naming these priests, and what we know from Jeffrey Anderson, the attorney, who's helped Jim in so many other cases of priest sex abuse, is that there apparently is a list of known and acknowledged priest pedophiles that the Archdiocese has. And so what Jim was trying to do is, and many others in fact have tried to as well, get the Archdiocese of Minneapolis and St. Paul to release those names so that communities and churches could know if there was a priest pedophile amongst them and could take measures to protect their children or their community. Am I getting that right?
Pretty much. St. Paul, Minneapolis, St. Paul Diocese has the list, and Winona has the list. Right. And those were the two dioceses involved in my case. And
Winona, because Adamson, this priest, was in Winona.
Yeah, his first victims were through Rochester's and Lourdes High School and whatnot.
So while he was your priest in Minneapolis St. Paul Church, or a suburb of Minneapolis St. Paul, the case had to go through Winona because that's where he was last, right?
And there was documentation of Winona's diocese knowing of his activity and not doing anything.
Got it.
Simply moving him. So during the course of my case, this list became known through disclosure, and then their side had a gag order put on it and sealed it. So Jeff Anderson does have a copy of the list. He's seen it, but he's sealed by the court, and the church certainly does not want it out. And the words that they use are, and this is the church's language, is credibly accused. So these are, and I cannot remember the
So they
exact-
acknowledge that these are credibly accused priest pedophiles.
Correct. I believe
Or potential priest pedophiles, but
Right.
credibly, there's
so
some
there was
real
a victim
reason
somewhere
that they
came
were
forward
accused.
and said this happened.
This isn't just hyperbole, or this isn't a grudge that some former parishioner might have, or somebody piling on to make
No.
money on a lawsuit.
No,
These are acknowledged priests that had acknowledged issues with
Yes.
pedophilia.
And so for the church who downplays everything to acknowledge that,
It's
in my
enormous.
opinion, they've reached the appropriate threshold. A lot going back to the legal, why don't people go to the police? I think because it's the priest, you go to the church, and then the church immediately puts a cover on it. And so through our case, we were able to have, or I was able to see just an amazing amount of documents dating back hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Which ones shocked you the most? Was there some that really stood out?
There was one that was dated somewhere in like the 900s from the Pope, acknowledging that they had priests who weren't behaving well with young men. And I
Wow,
can't
so
even
it went
remember
way
exact-
back.
Yeah, it went way back. And then the timeline, when I looked, I think what really got me, actually got me at towards the end, after we lost our case, a priest came forward who was instrumental in blocking Father Tom from coming to his parish.
And who is this priest?
Father James.
Fitzpatrick?
Thank you. Yep. And so I met him, and I got to speak to him. And the way that they treated him through the process, because he first met Adamson 20 years earlier over the same situation. And the way that
And they're peers, they're both priests.
they were peers and both priests, and he brought his concerns to the bishop or vicar general or whomever it was at the time, and basically was told, your job is to be a priest, go back to your church, we'll deal with him. And their position was then they moved him, I believe, to Cottage Grove at that time. And when he came back around, Father Fitzpatrick basically heard his name and went, oh God, no, we're not taking him. And subsequently they put him at Risen Savior.
And Risen Savior at this time was a fairly young parish.
Very
It was
young
still young, and
parish.
it just moved to a new building,
Yeah.
a church. It had formerly
They took
been
our
in
great
a.
sledding hill away when they built the church.
I mean that.
That
Well, that
alone put a
alone
little
is a
bad taste.
problem. That's
Yeah.
right.
But yeah, we were
But the
really
church
young.
had been in a elementary school gym until then. So this is
Yeah.
a very new sort of
Very young
situation.
community. Apple Valley was, basically two large neighborhoods at that time. Burnsville was still quite young, and Mary Mother of the Church was growing, and we were taking some. It was just a
And that was
very-
the Burnsville
the
Church.
big church, yeah. And yeah, so the history with Father Tom was they would put him in young parishes with the rule of no contact with boys. But then
So how odd that seems, because young parishes would generally have young families.
correct. And the associate pastor is typically in charge of the academic and catechism and those types of things, which are
The
education
youth programs.
Yeah. And given his history in the schools as being a teacher, I think that's why he was put in that spot.
Okay, and he was a charming, gregarious priest. I
Right.
remember him being very friendly
Yep.
and handsome and
yeah.
athletic.
Yeah,
And
I remember his car really well. He had a brand new Reliant K car, and it would talk to you if the door was ajar. It'd be like the door is ajar, and it was learning what I learned through my own journey, because being trained for psychology, I didn't see it through the same eyes. So when I look back at it and I look at the grooming he did, and through some of my testimony at the Senate, I met some other victims of his that are close in age to mine, and we were able to talk in a little bit, and I just met
Can
it.
you share a little bit? I mean, I've
I
heard
was
of
his
this
mold.
grooming. So you were, okay, so
I-
can you give
all
us
of
some of
the-
that without
all
it
of
being
his
too...
victims were 7th, 8th, 9th grade boys. We were all 12 to 13, 14
From
years
great
old.
families.
From
You
good
weren't the children that
no.
were just floating around the neighborhoods,
No,
not
we
at
weren't
all.
that-
You were from the
We
leading...
weren't what you might think as that typical lost kid who's looking for that
Right,
connection
right,
with
right,
adults. I had a strong connection with my family. And the grooming was that idea that he's taking you golfing.
This is
and
huge.
It's big, the grooming being that I could walk through the rectory and back in the sanctuary and back where the priest got dressed and the wine was kept, and it nobody else could. You know, that sense of.
Could your mother, now your mother was, I remember your mother was a church leader and a Eucharistic minister.
No, she
could
never
she
went
even go back
no,
there? Yeah,
no,
so you even had more power
Yeah.
in a sense than your own mother, who was one of the founders of this church.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I could kind of, I felt really comfortable because, you know, if I rode my bike up to the church and he was there, you know, I could go back, remember where the sound booth was? I'd go up there and be able to mess around.
Very cool.
You know, it was a little, you know, as a 12, 13-year-old kid, that's cool. And, you know, when you're second of 4 boys, you are looking for, you know, anytime you can have a leg up.
Sure, absolutely, on
that.
your big brother.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, you know, and I think that's the kind of grooming. He made you feel important. He made you feel.
And anybody wants to feel important, regardless of how great your family is.
Yeah.
We all do.
And it felt always like it was the right thing to be hanging out with him until, you know, he started to cross boundaries.
And when can you share, and you'll decide?
Well, the first time was at a stoplight on Garden View and 140th. Used to be a 4-way stop.
Which is a major sort of in this community now. It was a small community at that time, but that is sort of the,
you know,
or one of the major
I think it's the
intersections.
4th hole of the golf course is right there, and that's where we're going. And he just, you know, started to touch on my leg and go up inside my shorts. You know, I remember just staring straight ahead at his dashboard. It was silver, and the Reliant K was right there, and just, you know, wanting so badly to hear the door is ajar, because then I could, you know, the door. But you know,
You'd have an excuse to.
Yeah, and
dear.
you know, and then when I met with Jeff, I could tell him stories, and he would just be like, "Yep, yep." Yep.
And Jeff, because he'd already worked with so many victims, this was standard protocol for the situation of priest pedophilia.
As Jeff and I got to know each other over the years, I mean, it was probably a couple of years into it, and Jeff never asked for 100%, tell me A to Z, how did the abuse go down? You know, that was the one thing through the church, that was never questioned. They never said, hey, that didn't happen.
Right.
Because my thought is he still lives over in Wisconsin somewhere.
Right.
You know, they pay for his stuff.
Right. The church does fund retired. I believe he is retired at this point.
Yeah, he's out of commission.
But they still do take care for him in terms of all of his costs and financial needs.
Yeah, and so my guess is they went to him and said, hey, Jimmy Keenan came forward, and he probably had that look. You know, and I think one of the most angry times I had.
So they didn't say, no, tell us what happened. They never asked you to explain that.
They acknowledged and accepted the fact that the abuse happened the entire time, and which tells me something.
Right.
I mean,
so they not only didn't ask you, but they also didn't say, no, you're wrong. So
No.
they didn't even make any attempts to dissuade you from anything.
It was really about what can we do to get this to go away. That was really the most.
So you moved into a lawsuit then. Tell me the lawsuit. Remind us again how, you know, when did that start?
We started it was right around 2004, I think, when it was filed. It was kind of a leading up period, and then in 2011 we lost our case.
Okay, so it took that
7
long
years.
to even get through the entire case.
Yeah, it was one of those situations where we would hurry up and then wait, hurry up, and they sent me out to Boston, to Harvard to get all, you know, checked by psychiatrists and all of this, and
this is the church
church
that
did.
demanded that you had a psychological consultation,
full,
and not just one locally.
No, I had to fly to Boston.
You had to go to Harvard to get a psych check.
And it lasted all of about 12 minutes.
Really?
Yeah. He didn't know what I did for a living, and he asked me a series of questions that were absolutely meaningless in terms of my opinion to anything, and he said, all right, I've got all I need. And I said, well, I too am a psychologist, and I've never done a 15-minute assessment, especially not on a case like this. And he's like, I have all I need.
Really? And what were his findings?
His findings were that I most likely had memories the entire time. He didn't believe in repressed memories, and he was their expert.
And the case was, I suppose, somewhat dependent on repressed memory because of the statute of limitations issue, right?
Yeah, you have 7 years or 6 years from the time you know you're victimized. So it was very much hinging on that.
So in 15 minutes, he determined that he made a psychological diagnosis, right? Yeah. That you were perfectly aware of all the abuse all this time and had never had repressed or denial of the situation.
And that somehow I was just
And that, of course, supported the Archdiocese's case against you, so they would not have to settle with you in any case, in any way.
So yes, so after the mediation, the case got thrown out on statute of limitations. We appealed. We won almost unanimously on appeal, and that's when it went to the Supreme Court.
And then what?
And then we lost. I believe it was a 4-3 vote with one person
on the same predication that it's just not a repressed memory. That was it. There was nothing, no extraneous or more.
There's some legal stuff going on in there, but and I cannot remember. We didn't meet some threshold of some sort.
Okay.
You know, and the first guy through the door always gets knocked in the head the hardest.
Right, and so you were the first guy through the door. Explain that.
To go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Right,
Most cases were settled out. And when we did our mediation, it was about 16 hours worth of me saying, I am not going to talk any numbers until you talk about releasing this list and changing how you do things.
So during mediation, you didn't want to negotiate your financial settlement. That was not your primary concern.
No.
Okay, and your primary concern was getting the names of these priests, these known priests, credibly accused priest pedophiles, names published.
Right, and the finances would have been great, because at the time I was losing 2 businesses. So my wife and I actually—
Because of all of this?
Because of the economy at the time, and because of some other factors. Partially, one probably was my not being 100% on my job.
Well, I can't imagine that. I mean, with due respect, I know you to be very professional, and yet that's an awful lot to be dealing with while you're trying to run it.
So we actually ended up filing bankruptcy in 2010. You know, and if money was—
So you needed the money.
Oh, geez, would have been great.
So why weren't you hammering away at the money?
The problem I had with it was the business I left. I had bought a resort, and I was building a place where families who had children with mental health illness, autism, and specifically, could come and have a vacation. And so my waiter staff and my cook staff and everybody who worked there knew about children's mental health. I spent a lot of time. And so that was my passion, and we lost the business because of the bank crisis in 2008, and it would have been great. I could have paid that off and
continue that work.
But what happens when a kid comes up to the resort and says, hey, heard you won your case, but nothing really changed. You got your money, but nothing really changed. And because of that, I was abused too. I cannot fathom a bank account big enough to make that.
So that didn't feel so good. You know, I can keep the business going, but it's really incongruent because you're trying to treat children that might have.
Because if they didn't change, somebody else is going to get abused.
So this is the issue in civic engagement. This is a big issue in civic engagement. It has to do with, do you address policy or do you change culture? And there's a lot of civic engagement practitioners, and I actually would be one of them, that says that culture is the primary method of change, that culture almost trumps policy in a sense. So if culture has changed enough, policy will generally follow. That wasn't the case here.
No.
You needed the policy to change things.
Yep, and the culture eventually. And they were just kind of a basket weave together, but I just really couldn't.
But the culture hadn't substantively changed, it sounds like. I mean, everything that we know is there was, even while you were working on your case and working with Jeff Anderson and the courts and trying to get this resolved, there were still emerging issues.
Oh, absolutely.
Right, so there wasn't a cultural change. There wasn't enough of us parents out there that were aware or able to navigate or mitigate or whatever the case may be.
The masses weren't standing up and going, hey, we disagree with this.
Right.
They were still doing what they were doing. So,
and the priests, some of the priests were still struggling with
absolutely
with abuse issues. They were still abusing.
Absolutely. You know, and it was still the just let's somehow squash it, move them, or take them out of service. But they were never being held accountable to the level that anybody would.
So the only way in your mind that you could solve this was it was as simple as publishing this list of credibly accused priests.
Right.
Okay, so then, so you lost at the Supreme Court, and then you were sued by the Archdiocese, right?
Yes, I was.
Okay, so how?
I was sued for taxation, and so basically suing for their legal cost. Excuse me. And that was really an interesting day. It started out at $68,000, and then it jumped to $164,000. And then I think it got as high as $284,000.
And this is after they had sometime earlier proposed a $50,000 settlement.
Yeah, that was their opening offer.
So they were willing to make a settlement that was far less that now they were going to turn around and
Right.
demand of you.
Well, I explained it to people that they tried to pay me to be quiet, and
Right.
I said no.
Right.
And then they were going to sue me and make me pay unless I was quiet, because
Right.
they just don't want anybody to be noisy.
Why not? I mean, these are
I
many
don't-
of them. Some of these priests are good guys, and some of the
Exactly.
leadership
Are good
good people. That they have done important things
Yes.
separate from this horrible issue, and it's a horrible issue. I
It
mean, I
is.
don't want to undermine it,
What
but
I don't understand is our society has a solution for the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Any other agency, entity, business, workplace, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
if they encounter somebody who engages in this, they call the police, and we have a system to deal with them.
in their schools, our teachers have to.
Absolutely.
Any adult that is engaged in any way
Yeah, mandated
professionally
reporter.
with a child must call the
Yes,
police, or they
absolutely.
are in violation of the law.
And you don't have to have had any investigation on it. You
Mm-hmm.
just have to have knowledge or a strong belief that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
For whatever reason, the church engages on the belief that they don't have to. And they deal with it internally, and they really don't deal with it.
Right, right.
And I for the
And
love of
how
gosh, I don't
frustrating it
understand.
is for those of us, and I'm Catholic as well, to see the church continually say it's dealing with it, and then not too long after finding out that it really hasn't been
No.
able to, for whatever reason, for all the complicated reasons that an institution deals with. And I don't think either you or I are interested in bashing the Catholic Church,
No.
but we're certainly interested in bringing the truth out. I know that's your
Accountability,
mission. Yeah,
you know.
and protection of this not
You
happening
know,
anymore.
and just
right?
change in policy. I mean, it's as simple as if you accuse our priest and we're not going to investigate it, we're going to turn it over and let somebody else investigate. If they are found innocent, we're going to celebrate them.
And public safety arguably doesn't have quite the same impetus to protect a priest that the church does.
Correct.
I mean, the church is going to have a natural, I mean, I think just by sheer, accessibility or closeness with the priest, they're going to have a natural desire to somehow or another see that priest as being innocent,
Right.
even if they're really being objective. It's very hard to do in any institution or organization, and certainly would know these priests as
Right.
people, as friends, perhaps even.
Well, and the thing is none of the priests really deny that they've done it.
Right, right.
In a weird way, I have a level of empathy for Father Tom, because it's no different than putting, a drunk in a
Right,
bar
right,
and
right.
saying you're the barkeep now,
Right, right.
or a diabetic in a candy
So,
store. and
so
saying-
so what you're saying then, Jim, is that we are, in a sense, perpetrating this problem because
Absolutely.
without having clear policies that are public policies, not just church policies,
Right.
but that are civic policies through the courts, we are in essence doing exactly what some of the most fearful people think, and that is having a place where if you have those impulses and if you're having a hard time controlling them, you've got some sense that you might still be able to get by with it.
Right.
Even if you know it's sick, even if
Right.
you don't want to have those impulses.
Right.
So in a way, this isn't serving the priests
No,
at all either.
no. And he had done some counseling, we found out through records, and basically at one point said, nah, I don't want any more. So nobody stepped in and said, well, you're not going to stop, so we're going to stop you.
So this would be akin to putting an alcoholic in the job of a bartender,
Correct.
right?
Pretty much.
Okay. And we wouldn't dare do that.
No.
To protect
be
them
cruel.
and to protect us.
Right.
And it'd be cruel, right? So the church countersues, and tell me, let's go back to that day. It started out at 68,000 and then it shot very quickly
jumped
up.
and
And by
jumped and
that day
jumped.
you were doing a press conference
Right.
as well.
And kind of pretty much talking about what we're talking about.
And did you know that this was coming? Did you know that they were going to make this lawsuit?
Yeah, was it? No,
Or
I
you knew
didn't-
the lawsuit was, or the countersuit was there.
Well, I didn't know. I didn't find out till I saw it on the front page of the paper.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
And my dad called me because he knows I don't always get the paper. And so I was like, holy smokes. And then Jeff called me and he's like, we're going to rally the troops. And, you're the first, I'm the first one that I know of that has been sued back. And so, which told me was, wow, they really want this person not to get involved here.
They want you quiet.
Yeah.
They
and-
want to
and-
put a lid on this.
And I think partially is because I'm not afraid to talk about it now. I've done my work. I've healed a lot of who I am. It's still hard time at
I'm
times.
sure. I'm sure.
And I think they know that I can put an intelligent voice to it with thoughtful rhyme and reason, and it's hard to argue logic sometimes. I mean, it's hard to be anyone in the Catholic Church and say, yeah, but, you know, we do this, but, you know, here's the reason why. There really isn't a reason.
Well, so let's go back. Forgive me. I want to go back. I want to come back to this. But explain to me, why didn't the courts mandate this? I mean, this was part of your suit, wasn't it?
Mandate the list?
The list being
because
produced.
they filed a motion to have it sealed
And the court and a judge agreed to this.
Absolutely.
And they couldn't unseal it.
No, unless it went to trial. If it
Okay.
went to trial, then it would be unsealed, and it would be our first bit of evidence. It would have been the first thing Jeff entered into evidence. And the evidence being, here is their.
And why didn't you do that then?
Because when we went to trial, when we were set up for trial, they made motion after motion after motion after motion, delaying for a long, long time, and eventually got it thrown out on statute of limitations.
So then you felt that you could maybe negotiate the list in mediation?
No, we did mediation and it failed. So then the next step was trial. They delayed that for a very long time.
Hoping that you'd run out of money or get tired of this or give it up?
Well,
Or
and then finally, the court threw it out. And so then we appealed to the State Appeals Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said, no, this has merit. You know, we haven't had this type of case, but there are several other states that have, and there was court findings that.
And in fact, I think around that, towards the end of your case with the courts, there was a bishop that was prosecuted in Kansas, I believe, right?
Yep.
So there was
There
plenty
some
burbling
legs,
at this time. Yeah.
absolutely. And so we went to the appeals court. They found in our favor. So the next step was the Supreme Court. And had we won the Supreme Court, we would have been back to trial court.
I see. Okay.
And so that's why it was so important for them to.
Got it. So because you didn't win at the Supreme Court, you couldn't go back.
It remains sealed.
Okay. So now let's go back to that day. So Jeff Anderson, your attorney, calls you up and says, "No, we're going to make this is crazy. So we're going to go out there in public." And so brought in the cameras and the press, and you were going to make a statement about the lawsuit, the countersuit of you by the Archdiocese.
And so we did.
And this, by the way, is the Archdiocese of Minneapolis-St. Paul now, right?
And Winona together.
And Winona together. Okay.
That's what kept
Got it.
ratcheting it up. And that's also the day that I met Father Fitzpatrick.
Okay.
And so Father Fitzpatrick was going to be somewhat of a smoking gun, if you will, at our trial, because he was one of the only priests Jeff's ever known who had firsthand knowledge of Adamson.
And he had tried to block Adamson from coming to your to that church.
And he had tried to
our
get
church.
Adamson help back in the late 60s, you know, at different parishes. And then their paths recrossed in 1980. So
you're in this press conference, and I've seen the video of it, and you're talking, you know, about just exactly what you're sharing here. You're basically putting it out there what this whole process has been, and now there's this lawsuit. During that press conference, the church changed its mind on that, didn't it?
They did, like during the press conference.
Right. So explain that.
We got a call. I think Jeff's office got a call, and then the Channel 5 guy, and I can't remember his name, whomever it was, I can't recall his name, must have got a text or some sort of email, and they kind of said, you know, they're not pursuing it. And, you know, it was relief. And
I remember your face was like, what just happened?
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I was a little dumbfounded. I was kind of like, you know,
Now,
someone's going to have to debrief me on it.
So it come to a complete halt after they'd, how high had they gone with it?
I think it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 250,000.
So they were suing you for $250,000, and during the press conference, they totally killed the lawsuit.
Yeah.
And do you presume that that's because you were doing the press conference?
I'm sure it had some part of it. I mean, definitely. The other part of it was, I think, PR-wise. You know, how can this big entity remotely justify, well, we're going to go back after a victim and send a message to all other victims?
And by the way, you were, one of the accusations that they made was that you were demanding money because of your bankruptcy, right?
Yeah, Channel 5 guy.
And so now they're suing you for upwards of almost $300,000, sort of picking on this guy that's.
Right. Well, and the other thing is it wouldn't have gone because the bankruptcy dates and the dates that they claimed all this happened. So any debt goes away.
Okay.
Or occurs.
Okay.
So that was, yay, bankruptcy helped.
Then, yeah. So then, what do you do? So now it's totally halted. Then what?
I remember going out into the lobby and talking with a few people, and Jeff and Mike came out, the two main attorneys, and Pat came out, and we all hugged, and I said exactly what you just asked. Now what? And Jeff's like, we're done. I'm like, we're done. He's like, you took it as far as you can go in the state law of Minnesota.
But you're not stopping. So that was the...
No, I remember asking Jeff and Pat, I'm like, okay, so when do I get to start speaking? When do you start finding luncheons and things that I can go to and start talking? Because that's what's going to have to happen.
Right, right.
And so there was a bill that was tried to be passed back in the late 90s, I think it was, around statute of limitations and failed, and several other attempts. And a couple of legislators said we're going to go forward, and Bob Sawerski from SNAP and Jeff asked if I would testify.
And SNAP is the Survivors Network of
Abused by Priests.
Abused by Priests, okay.
And I was like, absolutely. And so I got to go sit before several Senate and congressional subcommittees and tell my story. And that was awesome. That was really, really powerful.
So now you are in front of policymakers.
Now I'm in front of people who
forgive
can
me,
change.
but you'd struggled to get the policies changed through the court system. Now you're going straight to the court, the law creators.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Yep. And it was really powerful as they sat at their table, and I said, Jim, you're never going to get another 2.5 minutes with this audience. So I made sure I got to look at everybody's face. I had a couple that wouldn't look at me, which I found interesting. And
what do you make of that?
I think it's really hard sometimes for people. I think it's hard. I think it's hard I think it's hard for people to actually get their arms around the fact that it happens. That's the hardest thing, because priests aren't supposed to do that.
Priests aren't supposed to do that, and many victims don't come out quite as whole as you've...
No, I've been so fortunate. When I look back at my journey, I mean, the fact that my bride didn't leave when I was a dork and drinking like a fish and angry and bitter, and because I was always scared, as a professional person in the community, you always want a certain
and it's like colleges, no less.
Absolutely.
Child's family as well.
Our work is all with kids, ages 2 to 20. And I think sometimes my family got my lowest points, and people I didn't know got my high points. And so I've been really fortunate to have really strong support. My kids, are awesome. We're very open, our family, so I talked to my kids about it. I shared with them what happened.
And this is your whole focus right now, is to keep things open, to talk about this not only in your family, but also in public and also in front of policymakers. And how did they react, other than the...
I got really good feedback afterwards. From the committees I talked to. The Congress people working on the bill were very happy. You can't fight the concept that everybody needs their day in court. Every victim, what makes us great is our voice. And I wasn't shy about saying that I felt like my voice had been robbed. Because of timelines, especially when the other entity wasn't arguing whether or not it happened.
Right. So in effect, they implied that they agreed, yes, Father Tom Adamson had abused you. They didn't do anything to deny that whatsoever. All they did was say, too late.
Yeah.
Right?
Right, pretty much. That was their course, and I just really took the strong approach of that we need to have a voice. And so we need to do away with the statute of limitations.
Was it useful in your mind to meet with the Congress people to do this testimony?
Yes, it was really good for me. It was good for me in a healing process because I got to see some of the wheels turn. I liked some of the questions. One person asked, well, what's to stop somebody who didn't get abused to come up and say, and I just was able to honestly look and say, you couldn't go through the journey I went through faking it.
So Jim, so you're meeting with Congress people. You're finding that it's very fulfilling, or it's very gratifying.
Mm-hmm.
You're feeling that you're understanding now how laws are created, and how, in fact, my sense is you're also understanding that there are certainly lawmakers. And this counters what a lot of us citizens sometimes feel these days. But there's lawmakers that really do care, that really
Yes.
do want to do something to improve our society.
100%. I was also open to the idea that their job isn't just to protect me as a victim. Their job is also to protect the accused. And they, you know, as much as I wanted them to come in and just throw out the statute of limitations, let's get everybody taken care of, you know, it was very eye-opening to see okay, we hear your part, and we're going to take it, and we're going to think about it, we're going to mill it through, and we're going to come up with fair for everybody.
And you felt that that was a fair process.
Yeah,
more
I did.
fair than when you approached the church.
Oh yes,
By
I
long
mean I
shot.
was heard. I felt heard by the lawmakers, and that felt really good. I left each time kind of feeling energetic.
At any point did your good wife ever say, "Jim, must you do all this? This is hard stuff,
Yes.
and you're in public."
Yes.
Okay. Or your mother? Tell me more about how they reacted on that.
Yeah. Well, my wife more worries about the impact on me, and when I would first start talking about it, I'd struggle with a little bit because I would start to ruminate a little bit and then start to question. And now I'm at a spot where I feel very confident that when I talk about my stuff, I do it in a way it's my stuff, but I want you to know about it, and I want you to know that there is this major entity that doesn't play by the rules, that needs to. Because partially I feel really bad for people who are, in my estimation, a little bit lost guided. You know, they're following a leadership that doesn't necessarily have their best interest in mind. So my wife has been really supportive. Even today when I told her I was coming, she's, you know, big hug, take care of yourself.
But there were times when she said,
Please don't.
Please don't.
There were times where she said, no.
Don't do it.
I just don't want you. You're not at a spot. I don't feel you're at a spot. Which was really good. Really
How
hard
about
for me
your
to hear.
family? Your family are really, your parents are very devout Catholics. They're really good people. They're leaders in the community in many, many ways. And many of us, second generation Catholics or third or whatever, struggle with this. And this again is one of those nuances of civic engagement. How do you face, you're the other now. You are the one that is kind of going against the family grain or the community grain. And how do you manage, how do you navigate that without losing everybody in the process or hurting a lot of feelings?
There were incredibly tense and aggravated moments. My dad and I actually got in a physical altercation, which was heartbreaking for both of us afterwards. His passion was, you know, wanting just to see his boy healed. Mine was, please understand why I don't want to be Catholic. And I'll never forget that night. All of a sudden, we're rolling around on the ground in the hallway out to the front yard, fighting over this religion that damaged me and damaged him, but neither of us knew how to do that.
And you're two men, no less. You're a dad.
We're grown people.
Trying to protect your son's healing and trying to keep the focus on that. And your son going, but this church is what hurt me.
Right.
Right.
And later, my dad and I have talked a lot about it, and you know, he had to come to terms with that. He didn't protect me. You know, that the abuse happened at their house once while he was at dinner. I mean, you know, that he would. My dad had just an incredibly hard time, and when he said that, I got it because I know the protection I want to give my boys. And so,
and this is the conflict. This is the conflict in every bit of polarized civic work or civic conversations or political conversations we have. I think this is it. I think your parents, very good people. You and your wife, wonderful citizens, really good people. Both passionate and for really very reasonable and if not important reasons. So having to come to terms with your differences in the way of approaching this without it falling into more and more fistfights or whatever. You know, how moving forward somehow owning your own truth without disparaging or hating their
Right.
truth, right?
Letting them have their, I understand that for my mom and dad, like I explained at the onset of the interview, that church is kind of where their social world starts and ends. It's where all their friends are from. All their activities are kind of centered around that.
And it's done good things for them,
It's
right?
done
I
great
mean,
things.
this
And
is the
it did great
complications,
things
right?
It did great things for my family. You know, my mom's got multiple sclerosis and as a result, several other medical issues. And the church for us was always a place where it was fun, like the Corman family, if you remember them, the Nice family.
Sure.
And we would do all these things together as, you know, 3, 4, 5 families, and you'd have, you know, 15 good Catholic kids running around and just having a blast.
Good, healthy fun.
Yeah, and then when it's all came to light, I felt so robbed. And the issue I had was I couldn't figure out why my mom and dad continued to support an entity that hurt me. And they kept saying it wasn't the entity, it was the man. And so I was trying to educate them. I'd get a document from Jeff and I'd say, look, you know, in 1963 they moved him, and you know, in 1971, and you know, and I'm like,
Was there any evolution in your parents?
yes.
Okay.
Before you know, if you look at it now, I think my mom and dad, my dad especially, he's quite supportive of me being out here. He's like, go get him, you know. And when the law changed, he's like, you're going to sue him again, right? And I was like, no, I'm not.
So what a turnaround, a complete turnaround. So at one point, you guys are rolling around in the front yard fighting each other, and now he's your biggest supporter and your biggest.
And I think at some point we kind of understood that I'm still going to love my mom and dad forever. I'm not going to fully understand their connection to the church. And I finally come to understand that I don't need to. And I can let them be that, but we also have an understanding. When my mom gave her sermon and they asked and I politely said no, it was a one-time ask. You know, my mom called, hey, do you want to know how it went? And I said, I just want to know, did you enjoy it? Did it go well? Yep, great.
So you've been able to build boundaries around your differences.
Yeah.
And this is really a healthy way of dealing with our differences, religious-wise, and certainly in cases like this, but even in broader ways. It's a really important issue for us to think about. And yours is probably the most poignant of all, because you're talking not only about sort of civic life and laws and politics and how do we change the world, quote unquote. You're talking about, this happened to me. I'm a victim and an advocate for change. So going back then to what happened after the Archdiocese dropped their lawsuit, you began doing more advocacy, and here you are today, and it's a few years later, and actually you and I exchanged comments on a Facebook comment that I'd put out, and you offered to speak with me. And so you remain on your mission, and tell me where your mission is right now. How is it different or evolved? Or
well, after the law got changed and we were able to compromise on a bill with integrity.
So the statute of limitations was changed.
It was. There was a 3-year window opened up for anybody that was abused prior to, I believe, August of 2013.
Okay.
That they could come back and enter their case. And going forward, there is no more statute of
There's
limitations.
no statute of limitations at all.
So I feel like I
you
got
achieved
quite a victory.
Huge victory.
Yeah, because I think that the church knowing I'm going to back up a little bit. There are several memos where high-ranking church officials will ask, when does the statute end? When is the statute of limitations up on this case? And you can tell that part of their mentality of protection was, we'll just kind of play it out.
Sure.
Now they don't have that.
We will stall, perhaps, you know, and their lawyers would be advising this.
Absolutely. So now we have a situation where they don't have that card anymore.
Right.
So hopefully that'll help push some things.
My comment or my status update on Facebook was inspired by an awful lot of activity around this. There's been in the media, you know, it's October, I think, starting in September, there was a few days there, or maybe a week or so, where every day the front page of the newspaper was dealing with changes. And this is enormous, because since then, there has been 3 archdiocesan leaders who have resigned resigned positions, not necessarily their entire role, but one is Archbishop Flynn, who would have been involved.
He was involved in my case.
In your case. The other, he resigned from St. Thomas University Board.
Yep.
Father Kevin McDonough resigned also from a
Right.
board, and there was an actual employee of the Archdiocese who resigned from the Archdiocese, from working with the Archdiocese.
Yep.
So how did that kind of affect you, and do you think that has to do with some of the changes that you were able to make?
It always makes me think about things again.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I see it on the thing, because now people know me, so I'll get a lot of text and Facebook of,
Mm-hmm.
hey, did you happen to see, thinking about you. My son called me one night and he's like, Dad, I know you're out with Mom, but it's on the news again. I was just thinking about you. So I get sad that he wonders and questions.
He
and is my
identifies Dad
okay?
as, yeah.
So that part of things good. But I do think it has to do with some of the work we did, because I don't know any of the history of the current cases that I think he's put out 2 or 3 in the recent weeks. I don't know if those historically wouldn't have been
So, yeah, but
triable
the
or
question is, and this really goes to your efforts. I mean, it seems to me that when you're doing the work that you've been doing for some years now, you're not always clear what you
Correct.
want the outcomes to be, and in some cases, some ways, certainly the statute of limitations was a good outcome for you, but you can't always nail down exactly what your work has achieved.
And yes, no, you can't.
And yet, it's hard to believe that it didn't have something to do with this.
I think I impacted it. I certainly had. I think my case had an influence. I think any time there's a voice put to this, somebody has to be thinking.
And your case, again, was the first one to ask for the names, and that is
Correct.
specifically what is out right now on the table.
Yes, exactly, because then we have total transparency. Then we know, if you drop your child off at the next Catholic event, how are you to know that one of those priests isn't there?
Right,
You
right.
don't know.
Right,
They know,
right,
and I just don't see how that's good for anybody.
right, right. You've heard nothing from the Archdiocese at all?
Never.
Never.
Since, no.
And did you know any of the recent Father McDonough or
I knew their
Archbishop
names by
Flynn?
reading documents. Archbishop.
Were you surprised by either of those?
No, I think it's
Okay.
been a long time coming that they needed to step down. But in their stepping down, whoever replaces them really needs to kind of take their game to a new level and
Well,
make some things happen.
And just to clarify, they didn't step down from their archdiocese,
No, they stepped down from
archdiocese
boards.
positions, I don't believe. But it was boards. It was more sort of connected boards, but
Yeah.
not directly with the archdiocese.
Right, that's my understanding.
They are
also.
still both. Well, I take that back. Flynn has retired.
Yeah, he's in upstate New York. or
Some
something, right?
years ago,
Yeah.
and Kevin McDonough is still involved with the
Yeah.
Archdiocese,
So-
and both beloved leaders.
Mhm.
So this is a complex issue.
It is, and and to me, I keep going back, the easy answer is our society already has a system for pedophiles.
Right, right,
Place your pedophiles in the system
right,
and
right,
let it go.
right.
And without shame. I mean, if your parish has a priest who chooses to engage in that, the minute you find out, you call the local authorities,
Right.
he's removed and processed as any other citizen would be.
As he would be perhaps if he had a serious mental illness or
Right.
or
Or if he worked at any
alcoholic
other
or
job.
any other job.
Yeah.
Right. This is not punitive in the way of shame. It's more protective of
Right.
both the priest and
And
certainly children and their
Exactly.
communities.
So I get confused why we have to watch the church try to go through this process of creating all these channels of processes. We have one. In my company, if one of my therapists is accused of this, I have a process.
Right.
Your service with me stops, and I call Detective so-and-so and say, here they are, here's the information.
And herein lies the difference and the importance of your civic engagement. You couldn't make any progress with the
Right.
archdiocese is 2 archdioceses, right?
Correct.
And the courts were a mixed bag for you. So only really when you went to the legislators did you really get some concrete changes.
Right. And now we can see cases go through the system, and I can come out and talk with people like you and whomever else wants to listen and share the story.
What if this all goes away? What if the archdiocese admits to all this and says, so we're going to let go of we're going to release the names. We are no longer going to even try to get involved in these cases. They'll go directly to the police. What would you do then with all this? I mean, this might be a little bit idealistic,
well,
but one can hope.
Would you rejoin the church? And honestly, I would have to say probably not. Only because religion is really changed in my world. You know, I consider myself, I see religion as more of an organized movement of adults who claim to be spiritual leaders guiding. And I'm much more spiritual now, where I have really kind of taken and said, okay, my relationship with God is my relationship with God. And I'm going to study the Bible, I'm going to read, I'm going to live my life in a way that says, I'm going to be nice to you, you're going to be nice to me, and we'll be okay.
And what you've learned, as many, particularly of us Catholics, and sometimes we joke about this, and yet it is quite serious, the challenge of institutionalized organizations, and in a way our civilization, if you will, needs some, we think needs some organization. Without policymakers, which is also part of an institution and one that is often assailed as being totally screwed up and hurting people, right? So our politicians are part of an institution that can be really troubling, and yet, in your case, they were able to solve an important part of the issue that you're trying to deal with. So the challenge then is, how do we as citizens interface with the institutions we choose to, whether it's a church or politics? And most important, and this is I think what you're getting at, is how do we not lose who we are and how we engage with the world in spite of all these issues.
I think that's about where I'm at.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. This has been exhaustive and really, really important stuff. We really appreciate you coming out and talking.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim. That was Jim Keenan of Apple Valley, raised in Apple Valley, Minnesota, and now in Savage, Minnesota, sharing a really powerful story about how civic engagement has, in some ways, worked for him, and in some ways, he's continuing his efforts to change his world around issues that he personally dealt with and now professionally does as well.